Nashville, Tennessee. Maximum Security Institution. May 21st, 2026, 10:22 in the morning. A 57-year-old man named Tony Carruthers is strapped to a gurney inside an execution chamber. He has eaten his last meal. He has said his goodbyes. The witnesses are seated behind glass. The death warrant is signed. The drug, a lethal dose of pentobarbital, is ready. All that is left is the needle, and the needle will not go in. The next 78 minutes, prison staff attempt to find a vein. They try his right arm. They try again and again. According to his attorney, who was inside that room, they puncture his body more than a dozen times. Tony Carruthers groans in pain. The backup IV line cannot be established. The doctor steps forward to attempt a central line, a needle inserted directly into the chest. But according to a court filing made public days later, that doctor had not performed this procedure in 13 years. He does not hold hospital privileges anywhere in the country. At 11:40 in the morning, execution is called off. The state of Tennessee has failed to kill Tony Carruthers. But here is the question that should keep every one of you watching. What if Tony Carruthers never should have been on that gurney in the first place? To understand how we got here, we need to go back to Memphis, Tennessee, February 24th, 1994. 3 people are reported missing. Marcellus Anderson, a local drug dealer, his mother, Deloy Anderson, and Anderson's teenage friend, Frederick Tucker. On March 3rd, 1994, their bodies are found buried beneath a grave at a Memphis cemetery. Marcellus and Frederick died of gunshot wounds.
Why didn't you listen?
Deloy Anderson had been beaten and suffocated. It is a brutal, horrifying crime. Memphis law enforcement comes under enormous pressure to find the killers. They focus on a 28-year-old man named Tony Von Carruthers. He had prior criminal history. He had been in and out of detention since the age of 14, and at the time of the murders, he was living with profound, documented mental illness, a condition his attorneys would later describe as schizoaffective disorder, bipolar type, combined with brain damage. 2 years later, in 1996, Tony Carruthers goes to trial at Shelby County Court for 3 counts of first-degree murder. He is convicted. He is sentenced to death. But here is what is critical. Here is what changes everything. Not a single piece of physical evidence links Tony Carruthers to that cemetery. Not a fingerprint, not a DNA match, not a weapon, nothing. The entire case against him rests on testimony. Testimony from informants, and one informant in particular, a career police asset named Alfredo Shaw. This is where the story gets dark, very dark. Alfredo Shaw testified before the grand jury that Tony Carruthers confessed to him, admitted his role in the murders. That testimony was the primary reason Carruthers was charged at all. According to the ACLU of Tennessee, Shaw was secretly a paid confidential informant working with law enforcement. The jury was never told this, but Shaw would later publicly recant. In a television interview, he said the confession never happened. He said he had been coached and coerced by police and prosecutors, and yet, under threat of perjury charges, Shaw was pressured back onto the stand at trial. Prosecutors told him they would arrest him if he contradicted his original grand jury statement. He repeated the confession story to the jury. The hidden financial arrangement between Shaw and law enforcement was kept from the defense and from the jury. Payment records only emerged in 2024, when Memphis elected a reform-minded prosecutor and finally shared Shaw's file with Carruthers' legal team. Tony Carruthers did not have a lawyer at trial. He had gone through 6 court-appointed defense attorneys. The judge, frustrated with Carruthers' behavior his doctors would later attribute directly to his untreated mental illness, refused to appoint a 7th. Carruthers was forced to represent himself. He had no legal training. He had a serious psychiatric condition, and he was fighting for his life. The result was what his own post-conviction attorneys described as one of the most singularly inept and disastrous self-defenses in modern American legal history. Key evidence went unchallenged. Expert witnesses were never called. The prosecution's narrative went largely unanswered. In April 1996, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Tony Carruthers was sentenced to death. Here is where the story becomes impossible to ignore. Carruthers' co-defendant in the case was a man named James Montgomery. Montgomery also received a death sentence in 1996. Montgomery had a lawyer on appeal. That lawyer did something remarkable. Obtained DNA testing of a blanket buried with the victims. DNA on that blanket did not match James Montgomery, so did not match Tony Carruthers. belonged to an unidentified male. No one else was at that scene. Star witness recanted. Physical evidence collapsed. The state of Tennessee offered Montgomery a plea deal, accepted a 27-year sentence, released from prison in 2015. Tony Carruthers, whose case was identical, received no such offer. He remained on death row. In 2011, Montgomery's own attorneys identified an alternative suspect. They pointed investigators to a different man. According to court filings, that suspect's DNA and fingerprints have never been compared to the unidentified biological material found at the crime scene. Not once in 30 years. As the May 21st execution date approached, over 130,000 people signed a petition calling for the state to test that evidence before proceeding. The ACLU filed emergency motions in state and federal courts. Kim Kardashian, who has 345 million Instagram followers, posted a direct call to action, urging the public to phone Governor Bill Lee's office and demand DNA testing. On May 19, 2026, Governor Lee issued a written statement. He said he had given the case deliberate consideration. He said he was upholding the sentence of the state of Tennessee. He said he did not plan to intervene. 2 days later, Tony Carruthers was strapped to the gurney. Here is what the mainstream coverage has not fully examined. The doctor assigned to establish the IV lines for this execution, later identified in court filings as Dr. Mark Fowler, had not placed a central line in a patient in over 13 years, according to his own deposition. He does not hold privileges at any hospital in the United States. He told investigators he prefers a technique using the subclavian vein by manual landmark. Without ultrasound guidance, medical literature cited in subsequent court filings identifies the subclavian vein as the most dangerous vein in the human body for this kind of procedure. An improperly placed central IV line can cause a person to bleed to death. And here is the detail that has received almost no attention. The Tennessee Department of Corrections had been warned. In 2022, Governor Lee himself halted executions after an investigation found that state officials had broken their own lethal injection rules in a separate case. The state promised reform, and yet on May 21, 2026, a doctor without current hospital privileges and without relevant experience in over a decade was the person standing over Tony Carruthers with a needle. This was not an accident. This was a system making deliberate choices about how little it needs to justify the taking of a human life. And the broader picture is just as disturbing. According to the Innocence Project, roughly 1/4 of all death row exonerations in the United States involve cases where jailhouse informants or paid snitches provided the critical testimony. The National Registry of Exonerations had recorded 3,696 wrongful conviction reversals by June 2025. Nearly 150 exonerations were recorded in 2024 alone. Tony Carruthers is not an outlier. He is a pattern. Governor Lee has granted a 1-year reprieve. That reprieve expires in May 2027. 3 more individuals are currently scheduled for execution in Tennessee before the end of 2026. Anthony Darrell Dugard Hines on August 13th, Krista Pike on September 30th, and Gary Wayne Sutton on December 3rd. The system that failed on May 21st is preparing to try again. As for Tony Carruthers, his attorneys have filed a federal lawsuit seeking to block any future execution attempt unless performed by a physician who is demonstrably qualified, holds current hospital privileges, and is authorized by a legitimate medical facility to establish a central IV line. A Davidson County Chancery Court judge has ordered the state to preserve all evidence from the failed execution. The request for DNA and fingerprint testing remains unanswered. The unidentified DNA profile on the blanket found with the victims, the profile that is not Tony Carruthers and not James Montgomery, sits in a laboratory somewhere, uncompared to the alternative suspect identified 15 years ago. History offers a sobering precedent here. Since 1973, more than 190 people in the United States have been exonerated from death row, meaning the state had prepared to execute them for crimes they did not commit. Some were saved by DNA evidence, some by witnesses finally telling the truth, some by pure chance, Some were not saved in time at all. The DNA test that could resolve the Carruthers case takes approximately 2 weeks to complete. The state has had 30 years and has refused to run it. So, what does this story really mean? Tony Carruthers may be guilty. The state of Tennessee believes he is. But the system that convicted him in 1996 had no physical evidence, relied on a secretly paid informant who later recanted, denied him legal counsel due to untreated mental illness, and suppressed payment records for nearly 3 decades. His co-defendant, convicted of the same crime, was released a decade ago after DNA testing created reasonable doubt. The state refused to run the same test for Tony Carruthers. Then it hired a doctor who hadn't performed the required procedure in 13 years to execute him. Then it punctured him more than a dozen times in a room the public is not allowed to see. The visible actor here is the state of Tennessee. The systemic force is a death penalty apparatus that treats finality as more important than accuracy, where admitting error is harder than continuing an execution. And the hidden beneficiary is a legal and political establishment that has spent 30 years avoiding the one question this case demands. What if the DNA doesn't match? 1 test, 2 weeks, 30 years, and counting. There are 3 more executions scheduled in Tennessee before December 31st, 2026. The reprieve for Tony Carruthers lasts until May 2027. The DNA remains untested. The question for you is simple. If a state refuses to run a 2-week DNA test before executing a man who has no physical evidence against him, is that justice? Let us know in the comments what you think. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.